Part 1 of The Young Visitors, or Mr. Salteena's Plan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 1. Quite a Young Girl. Mr. Salteena was an elderly man of 42, and was fond of asking people to stay with him. He had quite a young girl staying with him of 17, named Ethel Montague. Mr. Salteena had dark short hair and moustache and whiskers which were very black and twisty. He was middle sized, and he had very pale blue eyes. He had a pale brown suit, but on Sundays he had a black one, and he had a topper every day as he thought it more becoming. Ethel Montague had fair hair done on the top and blue eyes. She had a blue velvet frock which had grown rather short in the sleeves. She had a black straw hat and kid gloves. One morning Mr. Salteena came down to breakfast and found Ethel had come down first, which was strange. Is the tea made, Ethel? He said, rubbing his hands. Yes, said Ethel, and such a queer shaped parcel has come for you. Yes, indeed, it was a queer shaped parcel. It was a hat box tied down very tight, and a letter stuffed between the string. Well, well, said Mr. Salteena, parcels do turn queer. I will read the letter first, and so saying he tore open the letter, and this is what it said. My dear Alfred, I want you to come for a stop with me, so I have sent you a top hat wrapped up in tissue paper inside the box. Will you wear it staying with me, because it is very uncommon. Please bring one of your young ladies, whichever is the prettiest in the face. I remain yours truly, Bernard Clark. Well, said Mr. Salteena, I shall take you to stay, Ethel, and fancy him sending me a top hat. Then Mr. S. opened the box, and there lay the most splendid top hat of a lovely rich tone, rather like grapes, with a ribbon round complete. Well, said Mr. Salteena peevishly, I don't know if I shall like it. The bow of the ribbon is too flighty for my age. Then he sat down and ate the egg which Ethel had so kindly laid for him. After he had finished his meal he got down and began to write to Bernard Clark. He ran upstairs on his fat legs and took out his blotter with a loud sniff, and this is what he wrote. My dear Bernard, certainly I shall come and stay with you next Monday. I will bring Ethel Montague, commonly called Miss M. She is very active and pretty. I do hope I shall enjoy myself with you. I am fond of digging in the garden, and I am partial to ladies if they are nice. I suppose it is my nature. I am not quite a gentleman, but you would hardly notice it, but can't be helped anyhow. We will come by the 3:15. Your old and valued friend, Alfred Salteena. Perhaps my readers will be wondering why Bernard Clark had asked Mr. Salteena to stay with him. He was a lonely man in a remote spot, and he liked people and parties, but he did not know many. What rot, muttered Bernard Clark as he read Mr. Salteena's letter. He was rather a presumptuous man. End of chapter. Chapter 2. Starting gaily. When the great morning came, Mr. Salteena did not have an egg for his breakfast, in case he should be sick on the journey. What top hat will you wear? Asked Ethel. I shall wear my best black and my white alpaca coat to keep off the dust and flies, replied Mr. Salteena. I shall put some red rouge on my face, said Ethel, because I am very pale owing to the drains in this house. You will look very silly, said Mr. Salteena with a dry laugh. Well, so will you, said Ethel in a snappy tone, and she ran out of the room with a very superior run, throwing out her legs behind, and her arms swinging in rhythm. Well, said the owner of the house, she has a most idiotic run. Presently Ethel came back in her best hat and a lovely velvet coat of royal blue. "Do I look nice in my get-up?" she asked. Mr Salteena surveyed her. "You look rather rash, my dear. Your colours don't quite match your face. But never mind. I am just going up to say goodbye to Rosalind, the housemaid." "Well, don't be long," said Ethel. Mr S. skipped upstairs to Rosalind's room. "Goodbye, Rosaline," he said. "I shall be back soon, and I hope I shall enjoy myself." "I make no doubt of that, sir," said Rosalind with a blush, as Mr Salteena silently put 2 and 6 on the dirty toilet cover. "Take care of your bronchitis," said Mr S. rather bashfully, and he hastily left the room, waving his hand carelessly to the housemaid. "Come along," cried Ethel, powdering her nose in the hall, "let us get into the cab." Mr Salteena did not care for powder, but he was an unselfish man, so he dashed into the cab. "Sit down," said Ethel, as the cabman waved his whip. "You are standing on my luggage." "Well, I am paying for the cab," said Mr S., "so I might be allowed to put my feet where I like." They travelled second class in the train, and Ethel was longing to go first, but thought perhaps least said soonest mended. Mr Salteena got very excited in the train about his visit. Ethel was calm, but she felt excited inside. "Bernard has a big house," said Mr S., gazing at Ethel. "He is inclined to be rich." "Oh indeed," said Ethel, looking at some cows flashing past the window. Mr S. felt rather disheartened, so he read the paper till the train stopped, and the porters shouted "Rickamere Station." "We had better collect our traps," said Mr Salteena, and just then a very exalted footman in a cocked hat and olive green uniform put his head in at the window. "Are you for Rickamere Hall?" he said in impressive tones. "Well, yes, I am," said Mr Salteena, "and so is this lady." "Very good, sir," said the noble footman. "If you will alight I will see to your luggage. There is a conveyance awaiting you." "Oh, thank you," said Mr S., and he and Ethel stepped along the platform. Outside they found a lovely carriage lined with olive green cushions to match the footman, and the horses had green bridles and bows in their manes and tails. They got gingerly in. "Will he bring our luggage?" asked Ethel nervously. "I expect so," said Mr Salteena, lighting a very long cigar. "Do we tip him?" asked Ethel quietly. "Well, no, I don't think so, not yet. We had better just thank him politely." Just then the footman staggered out with the baggage. Ethel bowed gracefully over the door of the carriage, and Mr S. waved his hand as each bit of luggage was hoisted up, to make sure it was all there. Then he said "Thank you, my good fellow," very politely. "Not at all, sir," said the footman, and touched his cocked hat. He jumped actively to the box. "I was right not to tip him," whispered Mr Salteena. "The thing to do is to leave 2 and 6 on your dressing table when your stay is over." "Does he find it?" asked Ethel, who did not really know at all how to go on a visit. "I believe so," replied Mr Salteena. "Anyway it is quite the custom, and we can't help it if he does not. Now my dear, what do you think of the scenery?" "Very nice," said Ethel, gazing at the rich fur rug on her knees. Just then the carriage rolled into a beautiful drive with tall trees and big red flowers growing amid shiny dark leaves. Presently the haughty coachman pulled up with a great clatter at a huge front door with tall pillars each side of a big iron bell and 2 very clean scrapers. The doors flung open as if by magic, causing Ethel to jump, and a portly butler appeared on the scene with a very shiny shirt and a huge pale face. "Welcome, sir," he exclaimed good naturedly, as Mr Salteena alighted rather quickly from the vehicle, "and please to step inside." Mr Salteena stepped in as bid, followed by Ethel. The footman again struggled with the luggage, and the butler, Francis Minute by name, kindly lent a hand. The hall was very big and hung round with guns and mate and ancestors, giving it a gloomy but a grand air. The butler then showed them down a winding corridor till he came to a door which he flung open, shouting Mr Salteena and a lady, sir. A tall man of 29 rose from the sofa. He was rather bent in the middle, with very nice long legs, fairish hair, and blue eyes. Hullo, Alf, old boy, he cried, so you have got here all safe and no limbs broken. None, thank you, Bernard, replied Mr Salteena, shaking hands, and let me introduce Miss Montague. She is very pleased to come for this visit. Oh yes, gasped Ethel, blushing through her red rouge. Bernard looked at her keenly and turned a dark red. I am glad to see you, he said. I hope you will enjoy it, but I have not arranged any parties yet, as I don't know anybody. Don't worry, murmured Ethel, I don't mix much in society, and she gave him a dainty smile. I expect you would like some tea, said Bernard. I will ring. Yes, indeed we should, said Mr Salteena eagerly. Bernard pealed the bell, and the butler came in with a stately walk. Tea, please, Minute, cried Bernard Clark. With pleasure, sir, replied Minute with a deep bow. A glorious tea then came in on a gold tray, 2 kinds of bread and butter, a lovely jam roll, and lovely sugar cakes. Ethel's eyes began to sparkle, and she made several remarks during the meal. I expect you would now like to unpack, said Bernard when it was over. Well, yes, that is rather an idea, said Mr Salteena. I have given the best spare room to Miss Montague, said Bernard with a gallant bow, and yours, turning to Mr Salteena, opens out of it, so you will be nice and friendly. Both the rooms have big windows and a handsome view. How charming, said Ethel. Yes, well, let us go up, replied Bernard, and he led the way up many a winding stairway till they came to an oak door with some lovely swans and bulrushes painted on it. Here we are, he cried gaily. Ethel's room was indeed a handsome compartment, with purple silk curtains and a 4-post bed draped with the same shade. The toilet set was white with mauve, and there were some violets in a costly vase. Oh, I say, cried Ethel in surprise. I am glad you like it, said Bernard, and here we have yours, Alf. He opened the dividing doors and portrayed a smaller but dainty room, all in pale yellow and wild primroses. My own room is next the bathroom, said Bernard. It is decorated dark red, as I have sombre tastes. The bathroom has got a tip-up basin and a hose thing for washing your head. A good notion, said Mr Salteena, who was secretly getting jealous. Here we will leave our friends to unpack and end this chapter. End of chapter. Chapter 3. The First Evening. When they had unpacked, Mr Salteena and Ethel went downstairs to dinner. Mr Salteena had put on a complete evening suit, as he thought it was the correct idea, and some ruby studs he had got at a sale. Ethel had on a dress of yellow silk covered with tulle, which was quite in the fashion, and she had on a necklace which Mr Salteena gave her for a birthday present. She looked very becoming and pretty, and Bernard heaved a sigh as he gave her his arm to go into dinner. The butler Minute was quite ready for the fray, standing up and very stiff, and surrounded by 2 footmen in green plush and curly white wigs, who were called Charles and Horace. Well, said Mr Salteena, lapping up his turtle soup, you have a very sumptuous house, Bernard. His friend gave a weary smile and swallowed a few drops of sherry wine. It is fairly decent, he replied with a bashful glance at Ethel. After our repast I will show you over the premises. Many thanks, said Mr Salteena, getting rather flustered with his forks. You ought to give a ball, remarked Ethel. You have such large compartments. Yes, there is room enough, sighed Bernard. We might try a few steps, and meanwhile I might get to know a few people. So you might, responded Ethel, giving him a speaking look. Mr Salteena was growing a little peevish, but he cheered up when the port wine came on the table, and the butler put round some costly finger bowls. He did not have any in his own house, and he followed Bernard Clark's advice as to what to do with them. After dinner Ethel played some merry tunes on the piano, and Bernard responded with a rather loud song in a bass voice, and Ethel clapped him a good deal. Then Mr Salteena asked a few riddles, as he was not musical. Then Bernard said, Shall I show you over my domain? And they strolled into the gloomy hall. I see you have a lot of ancestors, said Mr Salteena in a jealous tone. Who are they? Well, said Bernard, they are all quite correct. This is my Aunt Caroline. She was rather eccentric and quite old. So I see, said Mr Salteena, and he passed on to a lady with a very tight waist and queerly shaped. That is Mary Ann Fudge, my grandmother, I think, said Bernard. She was very well known in her day. Why? Asked Ethel, who was rather curious by nature. Well, I don't quite know, said Bernard, but she was, and he moved away to the next picture. It was of a man with a fat smiley face and a red ribbon round him and a lot of medals. My great uncle Ambrose Fudge, said Bernard carelessly. He looks a thorough ancestor, said Ethel kindly. Well, he was, said Bernard in a proud tone. He was really the sinister son of Queen Victoria. Not really, cried Ethel in excited tones. But what does that mean? Well, I don't quite know, said Bernard Clark. It puzzles me very much, but ancestors do turn queer at times. Perhaps it means godson, said Mr Salteena in an intelligent voice. Well, I don't think so, said Bernard, but I mean to find out. It is very grand anyhow, said Ethel. It is that, replied her host genially. Who is this? said Mr Salteena, halting at a picture of a lady holding up some grapes and smiling a good deal. Her name was called Minnie Pilato, responded Bernard. She was rather far back, but a real relation, and she was engaged to the Earl of Tullyvarden, only it did not quite come off. What a pity, cried Ethel. Yes, it was rather, replied Bernard, but she married a captain in the navy and had 7 children, so she was quite all right. Here Mr Salteena thought he had better go to bed, as he had had a long journey. Bernard always had a few prayers in the hall and some whiskey afterwards, as he was rather pious, but Mr Salteena was not very addicted to prayers, so he marched up to bed. Ethel stayed, as she thought it would be a good thing. The butler came in, as he was a very holy man, and Bernard piously said the Our Father, and a very good hymn called I Will Keep My Anger Down, and a decade of the Rosary. Ethel chimed in quietly, and Frances Minute was most devout, and Ethel thought what a good holy family she was stopping with. So I will end my chapter. End of chapter. Chapter 4. Mr Salteena's Plan. Mr Salteena woke up rather early next day, and was surprised and delighted to find Horace the footman entering with a cup of tea. Oh, thank you, my man, said Mr Salteena, rolling over in the costly bed. Mr Clark is nearly out of the bath, sir, announced Horace. I will have great pleasure in turning it on for you, if such is your desire. Well, yes, you might, said Mr Salteena, seeing it was the idea, and Horace gave a profound bow. Ethel, are you getting up? shouted Mr Salteena. Very nearly, replied Ethel faintly from the next room. I say, said Mr Salteena excitedly, I have had some tea in bed. So have I, replied Ethel. Then Mr Salteena got into a mauve dressing gown with yellow tassels, and seizing his soap he wandered off to the bathroom, which was most sumptuous. It had a lovely white shiny bath and sparkling taps and several towels arrayed in readiness by thoughtful Horace. It also had a step for climbing up into the bath, and other good dodges of a rich nature. Mr Salteena washed himself well and felt very much better. After breakfast Mr Salteena asked Bernard if he could have some private conversation with him. Well, yes, replied Bernard, if you will come into my study we can have a few words. Can't I come too? muttered Ethel sulkily. No, my dear, said Mr Salteena, this is private. Perhaps later I might have a private chat with you, Miss Montague, said Bernard kindly. Oh, let's do, said Ethel. Then Bernard and Mr S strolled into the study and sat upon two armchairs. Fire away, said Bernard, lighting his pipe. Well, I can't exactly do that, said Mr Salteena in slow tones. It is a serious matter, and you can advise me as you are a thorough gentleman, I am sure. Well, yes, said Bernard. What can I do for you, Alf? You can help me perhaps to be more like a gentleman, said Mr Salteena, getting rather hot. I am quite all right, as they say, but I would like to be the real thing. Can it be done? He added, slapping his knees. I don't quite know, said Bernard. It might take a good time. Might it? said Mr S. But I would slave for years if need be. Bernard scratched his head. Why don't you try the Crystal Palace? He asked. Several people, earls and even dukes, have private compartments there. But I am not an earl, said Mr Salteena in a perplexed tone. True, replied Bernard, but I understand that there are sort of students there who want to get into the War Office and notable banks. Would that be a help? asked Mr Salteena eagerly. Well, it might, said Bernard. I can give you a letter to my old pal the Earl of Clincham, who lives there. He might rub you up, and by mixing with him you would probably grow more seemly. Oh, 10,000 thanks, said Mr Salteena. I will go there as soon as it can be arranged, if you would be so kind as to keep an eye on Ethel while I am away. Oh, yes, said Bernard. I may be running up to town for a few days, and she could come too. You are too kind, said Mr Salteena, and I don't think you will find her any trouble. No, I don't think I shall, said Bernard. She is a pretty girl, cheerful and active, and he blushed rather red. End of chapter. Chapter 5. The Crystal Palace. About 9 o'clock next morning Mr Salteena stood bag in hand in the ancestral hall, waiting for the vehicle to convey him to the station. Bernard Clark and Ethel were seated side by side on a costly sofa, gazing abstractedly at the parting guest. Horace had dashed off to put on his cocked hat as he was going into the barouche, but Francis Minute was roaming about the hall well prepared for any deed. Well, said Bernard, puffing at his meerschaum pipe, I hope you will get on, Alf. I am sure you have that little letter to old Clincham, eh? Indeed I have, said Mr Salteena. Many thanks for the same, and I do hope Ethel will behave properly. Oh yes, I expect she will, said Bernard with a sigh. I always do, said Ethel in a snappy tone. Just then there was a great clatter outside, and the sound of hoofs, and a loud neigh. The barouche, I take it, said Bernard, rising slowly. Quite correct, sir, said Minute, flinging wide the portals. Well, goodbye, Alf, old man, said Bernard Clark. Good luck, and God bless you, he added in a pious tone. Not at all, said Mr Salteena. I have enjoyed my stop, which has been short but sweet. Well, good-bye, Ethel, my child, he said as bag in hand he proceeded to the door. Francis Minute bowed low and handed a small parcel to Mr Salteena. A few sandwiches for the journey, he remarked. Oh, this is most kind, said Mr Salteena. Minute closed his eyes with a tired smile. Not kind, sir, he muttered, quite usual. Oh, really, said Mr Salteena, feeling rather flabbergasted. Well, good-bye, my good fellow, and he slipped 2 and 6 into the butler's open palm. Mr Salteena had to travel first class, as active Horace ran on to buy the ticket, which he presented with a low bow, the Times and Tit-Bits. Oh, many thanks, said Mr Salteena in a most airy voice. Now will you find me a corner seat in the train, eh? If there is one, sir, replied Horace. In got Mr Salteena to his first class carriage, surrounded by his luggage, carefully piled up by kindly Horace. The other passengers looked full of envy at the curly white wig and green plush uniform of Horace. Mr Salteena crossed his legs in a lordly way and flung a fur rug over his knees, though he was hot enough in all conscience. He began to feel this was the thin end of the partition, and he smiled as he gently tapped the letter in his coat tail pocket. When Mr Salteena arrived in London he began to stroll up the principal streets, thinking how gay all was. Presently he beheld a restaurant with a big menu outside, and he went boldly in. It was a sumptuous spot, all done up in gold, with plenty of looking glasses. Many handsome ladies and gentlemen were already partaking of choice food and rich wines and whiskey, and the scene was most lively. Mr Salteena had a little whiskey to make him feel more at home. Then he ate some curry to the tune of a merry waltz on the band. He beat time to the music and smiled kindly at the waiters, and he felt very excited inside. I am seeing life with a vengeance, he muttered to himself as he paid his bill at the desk. Outside Mr Salteena found a tall policeman. Could you direct me to the Crystal Palace, if you please, said Mr Salteena nervously. Well, said the genial policeman, my advice would be to take a cab, sir. Oh, would it, said Mr Salteena, then I will do so. He hailed a hansom and got speedily in. To the Crystal Palace, he cried gaily, and holding his bag on his knees he prepared to enjoy the sights of the metropolis. It was a merry drive, and all too soon the palace heaved in view. Mr Salteena sprang out and paid the man, and then he entered the wondrous edifice. His heart beat very fast as 2 huge men in gold braid flung open the doors. Inside was a lovely fountain in the middle, and all around were little stalls where you could buy sweets and lemonade, also scent handkerchiefs and many dainty articles. There were a lot of people, but nobody very notable. At last, after buying 2 bottles of scent and some rather nice sweets which stuck to his teeth, Mr Salteena beheld a wooden door on which was nailed a notice saying to the private compartments. Aha, said Mr Salteena to himself, this is evidently my next move, and he gently pushed open the door, straightening his top hat as he did so. Inside he found himself in a dimly lit passage with a thick and handsome carpet. Mr Salteena gazed round and beheld in the gloom a very superior gentleman in full evening dress, who was reading a newspaper and warming his hands on the hot water pipes. Mr Salteena advanced on tiptoe and coughed gently, as so far the gentleman had paid no attention. However, at the second cough he raised his eyes in a weary fashion. Do you want anything? He asked in a most noble voice. Mr Salteena got very flustered. Well, I'm seeking the Earl of Clincham, he began in a trembly voice. Are you by any chance him? He added most respectfully. No, not exactly, replied the other. My name happens to be Edward Procurio. I am half Italian, and I am the groom of the chambers. What chambers? asked Mr Salteena, blinking his eyes. These, said Edward Procurio, waving a thin arm. Mr Salteena then noticed several red doors with names of people on each one. Oh, I see, he said. Then perhaps you can tell me where the Earl of Clincham is to be found. At the end of the passage, fourth door down, said Procurio tritely. Of course he may be out. One never knows what they are up to. I suppose not, said Mr Salteena in an interested tone. One cannot gamble on anything, really, said Procurio, returning to the hot water pipes, though of course I know a lot more than most people about the inmates here. What are the habits of the Earl of Clincham? said Mr Salteena. Procurio gave a smile. Many and various, he replied. I can't say much in my position, but one lives and learns. He heaved a sigh and shrugged his shoulders. Well, good day, said Mr Salteena, feeling better for the chat. Procurio nodded in silence as Mr Salteena trotted off down the passage. At last he came to a door labelled Clincham, Earl of, in big letters. With a beating heart Mr Salteena pulled the bell and the door swung open of its own accord. At the same moment a cheery voice rang out from the distance. Come in, please. I am in the study, first door on the left. With a nervous bound Mr Salteena obeyed these directions and found himself in a small but handsome compartment done in dark green leather with crests on the chairs. Over the mantelpiece was hung the painting of a lady in a low neck, looking quite the thing. By the desk was seated a tall man of 35 with very nice eyes of a twinkly nature and curly hair. He wore quite a plain suit of palest grey but well made, and on one of the tables reposed a grey top hat which had evidently been on his head recently. He had a rose in his buttonhole, also a signet ring. Hello, said this pleasant fellow as Mr Salteena was spellbound on mat. Hello, your lordship, responded our hero, bowing low and dropping his hat. Do I address the Earl of Clincham? You do, said the Earl with a homely smile, and who do I address, eh? Our hero bowed again. Alfred Salteena, he said in deep tones. Oh, I see, said the kindly Earl. Well, come in, my man, and tell me who you are. Mr Salteena seated himself gingerly on the edge of a crested chair. To tell you the truth, my lord, I am not anyone of import, and I am not a gentleman, as they say. He ended, getting very red and hot. Have some whiskey, said Lord Clincham, and he poured the liquid into a glass at his elbow. Mr Salteena lapped it up thankfully. Well, my man, said the good-natured Earl, what I say is, what does it matter? We can't all be of the royal blood, can we? No, said Mr Salteena, but I suppose you are. Lord Clincham waved a careless hand. A small portion flows in my veins, he said, but it does not worry me at all, and after all, he added piously, at the day of judgment, what will be the odds? Mr Salteena heaved a sigh. I was thinking of this world, he said. Oh, I see, said the Earl, but my own idea is that these things are as piffle before the wind. Not being an Earl, I can't say, answered our hero, but may I beg you to read this letter, my lord? He produced Bernard's note from his coat tails. The Earl of Clincham took it in his long fingers. This is what it read. My dear Clincham, the bearer of this letter is an old friend of mine, not quite the right side of the blanket, as they say. In fact, he is the son of a first-rate butcher, but his mother was a decent family called Hyssops of the Glen, so you see he is not so bad, and is desirous of being the correct article. Could you rub him up a bit in society ways? I don't know much details about him, but no doubt he will supply all you need. I am keeping well, and hope you are. I must run up to the compartments one day and look you up. Yours as ever, your faithful friend, Bernard Clark. The Earl gave a slight cough and gazed at Mr Salteena thoughtfully. Have you much money? He asked, and are you prepared to spend a good deal? Oh yes, quite, gasped Mr Salteena. I have plenty in the bank, and £10 in ready gold in my purse. You see, these compartments are the haunts of the aristocracy, said the Earl, and they are kept going by people who have got something funny in their family, and who want to be less mere, if you can comprehend. Indeed I can, said Mr Salteena. Personally I am a bit partial to mere people, said his lordship, but the point is that we charge a goodly sum for our training here, but however if you can't pay you need not join. I can and will, proclaimed Mr Salteena, and he placed a £10 note on the desk. His lordship slipped it in his trouser pocket. It will be £42 before I have done with you, he said, but you can pay me here and there as convenient. Oh thank you, cried Mr Salteena. Not at all, said the Earl, and now to business. While here you will live in compartments in the basement known as lower range. You will get many hints from the groom of the chambers as to clothes and etiquette to menials. You will mix with me for grammar, and I might take you out hunting or shooting sometimes to give you a few tips. Also I have lots of ladies' parties which you will attend occasionally. Mr Salteena's eyes flashed with excitement. I shall enjoy that, he cried. His lordship coughed loudly. You may not marry while under instruction, he said firmly. Oh, I shall not need to, thank you, said Mr Salteena. You must also decide on a profession, said his lordship, as your instruction will vary accordingly. Could I be anything at Buckingham Palace? said Mr Salteena with flashing eyes. Oh well, I don't quite know, said the noble Earl. But you might perhaps gallop beside the royal barouche if you care to try. Oh indeed I should, cried Mr Salteena. I am very fond of fresh air and royalties. Well, said the Earl with a knowing smile, I might arrange it with the Prince of Wales, who I am rather intimate with. Not really, gasped Mr Salteena. Dear me, yes, remarked the Earl carelessly. And if we decide for you to gallop by the royal vehicle, you must be measured for some plush knickerbockers at once. Mr Salteena glanced at his rather fat legs and sighed. Well, I must go out now and call on a few dowagers, said his lordship, picking up his elegant top hat. Well, au revoir, he added with a good French accent. Adieu, my lord, cried Mr Salteena, not to be outdone. We meet anon, I take it. Not till tomorrow, answered the Earl. You will now proceed to the lower regions, where you will no doubt find tea. He nodded kindly and glided out in silence. Here I will end my chapter. End of chapter. Chapter 6. High Life. Mr Salteena awoke next morning in his small but pleasant room. It was done in green and white with monograms on the toilet set. He had a tiny white bed with a green quilt and a picture of the Nativity and one of Windsor Castle on the walls. The sun was shining over all these things as Mr Salteena opened his sleepy eyes. Just then there was a rat-tat on the door. Come in, called Mr Salteena, and in came Edward Procurio, balancing a tray very cleverly. He looked most elegant with his shiny black hair and pale yellow face and half shut eyes. He smiled in a very mysterious and superior way as he placed the tray on Mr Salteena's pointed knees. Your early beverage, he announced, and began to pull up the blinds, still smiling to himself. Oh thank you, cried Mr Salteena, feeling very towzled compared to this grand fellow. Then to his great surprise Procurio began to open the wardrobe and look at Mr Salteena's suits, making Italian exclamations under his breath. Mr Salteena dare not say a word, so he swallowed his tea and ate a Marie biscuit hastily. Presently Procurio advanced to the bed with a bright blue serge suit. Will you wear this today, sir? He asked quietly. Oh certainly, said Mr Salteena. And a clean shirt would not come amiss, said Procurio. What about this pale blue and white stripe? With pleasure, replied Mr Salteena. So Procurio laid them out in neat array, also a razor and brush for shaving. Then he opened a door, saying, This is the bathroom. Shall I turn on hot or cold?" "I don't mind," said Mr Salteena, feeling very hot and ignorant. "It is best for you to decide, sir," said Procurio firmly. "Well, I will try cold," said Mr Salteena, feeling it was more manly to say that. Procurio bowed and beat a retreat to the bathroom. Then he returned and told Mr Salteena that when he was washed he would find his breakfast in the sitting room. When Mr Salteena was dressed in his best blue suit and clean shirt, he strolled into the sitting room, where a gay canary was singing fit to burst in the window and a couple of doves cooing in a wicker cage. A cheery smell greeted him as Procurio glided in with some steaming coffee. Mr Salteena felt more at home and passed a few remarks about the weather. Procurio smiled and uncovered some lovely kidneys on toast, and as he did so bent and whispered in Mr Salteena's ear, "You should have come in your dressing gown." Mr Salteena gave a start. "Oh, can I?" he said. "10,000 thanks." Then Procurio passed out and Mr Salteena finished his kidneys and chirruped to the birds and had a cigarette from a handsome purple box which he found on the desk. Then Procurio entered once more and with a bow said, "His lordship is going to a levee this morning and thinks it might amuse you to go. Could you be ready by 11 o'clock?" "Oh yes, what fun," said Mr Salteena. "Have you any notion what a levee is, my man?" Procurio gave a superior smile. "It is a party given by the Queen to very superior people, but this one is given by the Prince of Wales, as the Queen is not quite her usual self today. It will be at Buckingham Palace, so you will drive with his lordship." Mr Salteena was fearfully excited. "What shall I wear?" he gasped. "Well, of course you ought to have black satin knickerbockers and a hat with white feathers, also garters and a star or two." "You surprise me," said Mr Salteena. "I have none of those articles." "Well," said Procurio kindly, "his lordship will lend you his second best cocked hat, as you are obliged to wear one, and I think with a little thought I might rig you up so as to pass muster." Then they rummaged among Mr Salteena's things and Procurio got very intelligent and advised Mr Salteena to wear his black evening suit and roll up his trousers. He also lent him a pair of white silk stockings which he fastened tightly round his knees with red rosettes. Then he quickly cut a star in silver paper and pinned it to his chest, and also added a strip of red ribbon across his shirt front. Then Mr Salteena surveyed himself in the glass. "Is it a fancy dress party?" he asked. "No, they always wear that kind of thing, but wait till you see his lordship. If you are ready, sir, I will conduct you in." Mr Salteena followed Procurio up countless stairs till they came to the Earl's compartments and tapped on the bedroom door. "Come in," cried a merry voice, and in they strode. "I have done my best with Mr Salteena, my lord. I trust he will do. The hat of course will make a deal of difference." Mr Salteena bowed nervously, wishing he had got correct knickerbockers, as his trousers did not feel too firm in spite of the garters. "Not half bad," cried the Earl. "Try on the hat, Salteena. It is on my bed." Mr Salteena placed it on his head, and the feathers and gold braid became him very well, but he felt very jealous of the Earl, who looked a sight for the gods. He had proper satin knickerbockers with diamond clasps, and buckled shoes, and black silk stockings which showed up his long fine legs. He had a floppy shirt of softest muslin with real lace collar and cuffs. A sword hung at his side, and a crimson sash was round his waist, and a splendid cocked hat on his head. His blue eyes twinkled as he pulled on a pair of white kid gloves. "Well, come on, Salteena," he cried, "and don't be nervous. I will get you a pair of knickers tomorrow. Will you get a handsome Procurio? Presently the Earl and Mr Salteena were clattering away to Buckingham Palace. You won't mind if I introduce you as Lord Hyssops, do you? Said the Earl as he lit his pipe. You see you are sort of mixed up with the family, so it won't matter, and will look better. So it would, said Mr Salteena. What do we do at the levee? Oh, we stroll around and eat ices and champagne and that kind of thing. Sometimes there is a little music. Is there any dancing? Asked Mr Salteena. Well, not always, said the Earl. I am glad of that, said Mr Salteena. I am not so nimble as I was, and my garters are a trifle tight. Sometimes we talk about the laws and politics, said the Earl, if Her Majesty is in that kind of mood. Just then the splendid edifice appeared in view, and Mr Salteena licked his dry lips at the sight of the vast crowd. All round were carriages full of costly people, and outside the railings stood tall life guards keeping off the mere people who had gathered to watch the nobility clatter up. Lord Clincham began to bow right and left, raising his cocked hat to his friends. There was a lot of laughter and friendly words as the cab finally drew up at the door. Two tall life guards whisked open the doors, and one of them kindly tipped the cabman. Mr Salteena followed his lordship up the grand steps, trying to feel as homely as he could. Then a splendid looking fellow in a red tunic and a sort of black velvet tam o' shanter stepped forward from the throng, shouting, What name, please? The Earl of Clincham and Lord Hyssops, calmly replied the Earl, gently nudging Mr Salteena to act up. Mr Salteena nodded and blinked at the menial, as much as to say, all is well, and then he and the Earl hung up their cocked hats on two pegs. This way, cried a deep voice, and another menial appeared wearing stiff white breeches, top boots, and a green velvet coat with a leather belt, also a very shiny top hat. They followed this fellow down countless corridors, and finally came to big folding doors. The Earl twiddled his moustache and slapped his leg with his white glove as calmly as could be. Mr Salteena perspired rather hard and gave a hitch to his garters to make sure. Then the portals divided, and their names were shouted in chorus by countless domestics. The sumptuous room was packed with men of a noble nature, dressed like the Earl in satin knickerbockers, etc., and with ladies of every hue, with long trains and jewels by the dozens. You could hardly move in the gay throng. Dukes were as naught, as there were a good lot of princes and archdukes, as it was a very superior levee indeed. The Earl and Mr Salteena struggled through the crowd till they came to a platform draped with white velvet. Here on a golden chair was seated the Prince of Wales in a lovely ermine cloak and a small but costly crown. He was chatting quite genially with some of the crowd. Up clambered the Earl, followed at top speed by Mr Salteena. Hullo, Clincham, cried the Prince, quite homely and not at all grand. So glad you turned up. Quite a squash, eh? A bit overpowering, your Highness, said the Earl, who was quite used to all this. May I introduce my friend Lord Hyssops? He is staying with me, so I thought I would bring him along, if you don't mind, Prince. Not at all, cried the genial Prince, looking rather surprised. Mr Salteena bowed so low he nearly fell off the platform, and as the Prince put out a hand Mr Salteena thought he had better kiss it. The Prince smiled kindly. I am pleased to see you, Lord Hyssops, he said in a regal voice. Then the Earl chipped in. And how is the dear Queen? He said reverently. Not up to much, said his Highness. She feels the heat, poor soul. And he waved to a placard which said in large letters, The Queen is indisposed. Presently his Highness rose. I think I will have a quiet glass of champagne, he said. You come too, Clincham, and bring your friend. The diplomats are arriving, and I am not much in the mood for deep talk. I have already signed a dozen documents, so I have done my duty. They all went out by a private door and found themselves in a smaller but gorgeous room. The Prince tapped on the table and instantly two menials in red tunics appeared. Bring 3 glasses of champagne, commanded the Prince, and some ices, he said majestically. The goods appeared as if by magic, and the Prince drew out a cigar case and passed it round. One grows weary of court life, he remarked. Oh yes, agreed the Earl. It upsets me, said the Prince, lapping up his strawberry ice. All I want is peace and quiet and a little fun, and here I am tied down to this life, he said, taking off his crown. Being royal has many painful drawbacks. True, mused the Earl. Silence fell, and the strains of the band could be heard from the next room. Suddenly the Prince gazed at Mr Salteena. Who did you say you were? He asked in a puzzled tone. Lord Hyssops, responded our hero, growing purple at the lie. Well, you are not a bit like the Lord Hyssops I know, replied the Prince. Could you explain matters? Mr Salteena gazed helplessly at the Earl, who had grown very pale, and seemed lost for the moment. However, he quickly recovered. He is quite all right really, Prince, he said. His mother was called Miss Hyssops of the Glen. Indeed, said his Royal Highness. That sounds correct. But who was your father, eh? Then Mr Salteena thought he would not tell a lie, so in trembly tones he muttered, My poor father was but a butcher, your Highness, a very honest one, I may add, and passing rich. He was called Dominic Salteena, and my name is Alfred Salteena. The Prince stroked his yellow beard and rather admired Mr Salteena for his truthful utterance. Oh, I see, he said. Well, why did you palm off on my menials as Lord Hyssops, eh? Mr Salteena wiped his sweating brow, but the Earl came to the rescue nobly. My fault entirely, Prince, he chimed in. As I was bringing him to this very superior levee, I thought it would be better to say he was of noble birth. Have I offended your royal dignity? Not much, said the Prince. It was a laudable notion, and perhaps I will ask Mr Salteena to one of my big balls some day. Oh, your Highness, gasped our hero, falling on one knee. That would indeed be a treat. I suppose, Prince, you have not got a job going at this place for my friend? asked the Earl. You see, I am rubbing him up in society ways, and he fancies court life as a profession. Oh, does he? Said the Prince, blinking his eyes. Well, I might see. I suggested if there was a vacancy going, he might try cantering after the royal barouche, said the Earl. So he might, said the Prince. I will speak to the Prime Minister about it and let you know. 10,000 thanks, cried Mr Salteena, bowing low. Well, now I must get along back to the levee, announced the Prince, putting on his crown. I have booked a waltz with the Archduchess of Greenwich, and this is her favourite tune. So saying, they issued back into the room where the nobility were whirling gaily round. The more serious people, such as the Prime Minister and the Admirals, etc., were eating ices and talking passionately about the laws in a low undertone. The Earl was soon mingling gaily in a set of Lancers, but Mr Salteena dare not because of his trousers. However, he sat on a velvet chair and quite enjoyed overhearing the intelligent conversation of the Prime Minister. And now we will leave our hero enjoying his glimpse of high life and return to Ethel Montague. End of chapter. End of part 1.